Welcome back to Tell Your Story Alaska. Today we continue our village profiles and we will be covering Arctic Village in Atka, Alaska. Now before I start, I have to comment that I was having dinner with my family last night and my wife suggested that I start using the term the story of Arctic Village rather than a village profile. And I think that's good insight to the history of these villages to be stories rather than just a profile. And I like that. So from now on, I'm going to say the story of such and such village. So today, we will be covering the story of Arctic Village and the story of Atka, Alaska. Now, if you remember from last week, we talked about how these next two villages on our list are really, really far apart. Arctic Village is in northeastern Alaska, and Atka is at the far extreme of the Aleutian Island Chain, way out in western Alaska, the most western community in the United States, actually. But we'll start with Arctic Village, Alaska. Arctic Village is on the east fork of the Chandelar River, 100 miles north of Fort Yukon, 290 miles north of Fairbanks. It kind of sits up there in the Brooks Range. The population is 151, and it is made up of mostly native residents. The highest temperature ever recorded in Arctic Village was 89 degrees. The coldest temperature was negative 68. Now, it's hard to imagine 89 degrees in any place called Arctic Village. But then again, the coldest temperature is negative 68. So you can, that kind of makes up for the hot temperature. And I actually think the record for the highest temperature recorded in Alaska was in Fort Yukon, not too far away. So that's interesting. Now, Arctic Village is not very ancient. It began to become a community in 1909, so not too long ago. Before this time, the Gwich'in people, which means residents of the north side, were nomadic, moving from place to place for hunting, fishing, and gathering on semi-permanent settlements. So the present-day location of Arctic Village is very likely one of these semi-permanent spots. The nomadic Gwich'in people, also sometimes called the Dingy Zoo people, began to obtain firearms in the early 1900s with the incoming European culture, which started, European and Russian, the history. But the outside culture brought in firearms in the early 1900s, and this started to change their nomadic ways. The firearms removed the need for the people to disperse into small bands for hunting. So now they can base out of a permanent settlement for the caribou hunts, which is what they did. The first reported permanent resident on the site was a man named Chief Christian, 1909. Now, I'm really curious about the nomadic style of living, which is a lifestyle almost unknown today, but much more common long ago. If you can imagine, there wouldn't have been private property, but it was a very communal way of living. So for small communities, I think that works well. It's a communal effort for their needs to be met. And I kind of saw this version of it when I worked with a native tribe in northern Mexico. They did not really have, private property. They lived in communities. They did seem to have an understanding of that area over there is that guy's and that area over there is that guy's. But it was less individualistic than our normal American society. So you can imagine in a nomadic setting, this was all a communal effort. So typically the men would hunt and the women would prepare the skins and the meats and make clothing. And they worked together as a community in that way. But today, with the bringing in of firearms, it would have looked quite different. Now, an important figure in Arctic Village's story was a man named Robert McDonald. McDonald was an Anglican missionary from Canada who spent most of his life serving the Gwich'in people. Now, Gwich'in is just referring to the name of the people group that lived in that area. In 1863, McDonald noticed that much of the caribou meat that was traded for the Fort Yukon, he lived in Fort Yukon, and most of the meat that they traded for from their needs came from the Gwich'in people. This is likely what drew his attention to them and led to his life's work among the Gwich'in people. He even married a Gwich'in woman named Julia Kutuk, with whom he had 9 children. And many of those children tragically died before he did. However, with the help of his Gwich'in wife, McDonald brought literacy to the Gwich'in people in their own language by translating the Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and some hymns. He also published a dictionary and grammar book entitled A Grammar of the Tukudh Language. Now, the word Tukudh is an older name for the Gwich'in language. So, if, we are Americans, but we speak English. These are the Gwich'in people, and they speak Tukudh. And so his book was called A Grammar of the Tukudh Language. Now, I found this fascinating because McDonald's work to bring literacy to the Gwich'in people is just a small microcosm of what missionaries have been doing worldwide for hundreds of years. Now, around the world, translations of the Bible have become preservatives of languages and cultures that would have otherwise been lost. Now, despite the reputation that missionaries have for robbing people of their culture, which there is some truth to that, it is more widely the case that missionaries have preserved cultures. Missionaries have made efforts to write down oral stories of tribal peoples and their traditions. They create alphabets for oral-only languages. Now, I did this when I was living in northern Mexico among the Tarahumara people. My coworkers utilized some previously done work by missionaries in the 1800s who were able to write down the sounds and some of the grammar of the Tarahumara language. Now, my coworkers took this older material from the 1800s and they created literacy programs so the native people could read and write in their own heart language. They kind of modernized it, and I played a role in much of that when I lived there. Now, around the world, this has been the main strategy of large mission organizations such as New Tribes or Wycliffe. They train their missionaries to spend years deciphering tribal languages that don't have any literacy form at all. They're able to listen to the language, to decipher the sounds, and then turn those into letters. And they begin writing down their cultural stories and translating the scriptures. Now, these efforts have been happening for hundreds of years around the world, and much of our knowledge of tribal people's histories have been because of these preservative efforts by missionaries. Now, this is the case for the Gwich'in people in the area of Arctic Village. Their language is now written because of McDonald's work. Another important person in the story of Arctic Village was when a young man from Arctic Village made his way to Fort Yukon and he heard the gospel preached, very likely from McDonald himself. Upon hearing the gospel, Albert E Tritt had become a follower of Jesus, and he took a copy of McDonald's Tukudh Bible and returned to Arctic Village so that he could share in his own heart language the scriptures. Tritt eventually became a deacon of the Episcopal Church, and by 1925 he ministered in the Old Missionary Church, or also called the Old Log Church, which was built in 1917. Through Tritt's efforts, he helped build a newer building in Arctic Village in 1939, and this building was added to the National Register of Historical Places in 1977. I thought that was pretty cool. So that church is still there today, and it is a protected historical place. In 1941, so this is before Alaska became a U.S. state, the Gwich'in tribal leader at the time was named John Fredson, and Fredson established the Veneti Indian Reservation, which at the time was the largest Indian reservation in Alaska at 1.4 million acres. However, in 1971, President Nixon passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. This act is important because it's a very pivotal time in Alaska's history, which set up the modern relationship between government and the native people of Alaska. One of the results of the Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 was that most of the reservations in Alaska were dissolved. However, the federal government paid massively to the tribes for their lands, while designating much of that land as tribal. Ultimately, the Gwich'in tribal lands were reduced in size, but in the 1980s, laws were codified to preserve traditional principles of caribou management as an effort to maintain Gwich'in traditional ways. And so today, even up to today, their caribou hunts are still a key part of the community culture and a way of their lives today. All right, that is a summary of the story of Arctic Village. So let's check out Atka, Alaska. Atka is the westernmost village in the country, not just the state of Alaska, but in the country. It's further west than Hawaii, which is crazy. It's way out there. Atka is located on Atka Island. It is 1,100 air miles from Anchorage and 90 air miles east of Adak. Atka is the most isolated native village on the Aleutian Island Chain. It is located further west than any other civilian community in the U.S. That's amazing. Now, the history of Atka, I spent some time reading some articles and looking into this about the ancient history of Alaska. Most places say the history goes back about 2,000 years. But there seems to be only scant evidence from various archaeological finds, such as bones, tools, and crafts that have been found. These just offer little hints, and there's a lot of efforts to extrapolate from these scant hints about who and when they got here. There's been efforts to do carbon dating and comparative DNA studies that have made attempts at determining when and where from the first Aleutians arrived. However, from what I read, it really seems like we just don't know. And I really wish we knew. But there's some scant evidence that gives us little hints. Okay. A report from the early Russian settlements estimate that there were 2,000 Aleut people on the entire island chain in 1831. So that was the Russian fur traders who were there. That was their guess. So whether this is accurate or not, it does not really tell us. It does tell us that these were very sparsely populated places on the Aleutian Chain, which means that, a community, quote unquote, may have just meant there was a couple of families surviving there together, maybe a little more than that, but very sparsely populated place. So I like to ask the question. So my curiosity is very sparked by this, but what would drive people to live out in such remote places? Why would they go there? I find this to be a very interesting curiosity, but I can speculate that they may have been fleeing from something, from some warring or conflict, or another possibility is that they washed up there on accident after being lost at sea. In fact, a few episodes back, I think it was a Amchitka Island episode, there's a story about some Japanese sailors who were drifting at sea for a very long time, and they ended up on the Aleutian Island Chains after being lost for some time. And now they were rescued, but it does make you wonder, maybe that's how the first people got here. Maybe they drifted and washed up there and they began to live there. That's a possibility. Or maybe they went there intentionally because they were trying to get away from a war or a conflict. I don't know. But it is very mysterious of why they went there originally. Now, the first contact was by the Russians in 1747, those earliest Russian explorers. By 1787, just a few years after the U.S. Constitution was ratified, so while over in, in Pennsylvania, we were debating our Constitution, over here in Alaska, the Russians were starting to settle in Atka. Now, at the time in 1787, Atka had become an important trade site and safe harbor for the Russian fur traders. Aleut hunters at the time were enslaved and relocated to Pribilof Island to work for the seal fur harvest. The Pribilof Island is really interesting. I don't know much about it, but it's an extremely remote island in the middle of the Bering Sea. Fascinating place, and we're going to get there one day. Pribilof Island. All right, by the 1860s, the site was moved. It wasn't moved, but it became more than just a trade site. People actually began to settle there in the 1860s. The fur trade seal economy diminished, however, in the late 1800s. And then in the 1920s, the fox farming economy kind of boomed, and it actually became sort of an affluent site. I did not go down the rabbit hole to find out what fox farming is. I can only imagine that the hides of foxes were valuable at the time, apparently valuable enough for a relative economic boom for Atka. Now, a radical change when the Japanese attacked Unalaska and seized the island of Attu and Kiska nearby in June of 1942. This became a radical change for Atka. Atka was evacuated and burned down by the U.S. government. They just burned the village to prevent Japanese forces from using the site for their military advancement. In all, 881 people from 9 villages, one of them being Atka, were forced from their homes, and they were only allowed to bring 1 suitcase per person with them. The residents of Atka were sent to Ketchikan, where 10% of them died of disease because of overcrowded living conditions there in Ketchikan. Now, this is obviously controversial, and rightly so, made a lot of people upset. But it also should be recognized that at the same time, the local Aleut people who were captured by the Japanese when they invaded, they had a much worse time. Most of them did not survive the harsh treatment of being Japanese POWs in the Japanese POW camps. They did not fare well for those who were captured by the Japanese. It would have been much better to be under the U.S., even though the U.S. could have done a much better job. But however you look at it, it was a very dark time for the Aleut people. Now, when the war ended in June of 1945, the residents were allowed to return to Atka, but the community was never the same with the quickly modernization of the world. However, the remoteness of the community still affords the people to live basically as they please. I did find some YouTube videos about some of the challenges that the people face today, like healthcare issues and diet. But it does look like the people, while having some connection and reliance from the outside, they still rely very much on fishing and local hunting for their sustenance. Today, the population of Atka is 53 people as of the 2020 census. So that's like 4 years ago, but I presume it's close to that at least. This number is significantly down from the 1860 census, which the fact that there's an 1860 census of Atka is kind of amazing. But at the time they counted in 1860, there was 236 people. So now at 53, this does show this decline does seem to coincide with an ever-changing world, becoming more, people moving to the cities and stuff. Now, there is a Russian, I don't know if it's Russian, but there is an Orthodox Church in Atka. It was founded in 1825, and it is called Saint Nicholas Church. Now, considering that it was founded in 1825 is actually amazing, because that means this church was there before the height of the Russian fur trade, and it means that it was there before World War II. And even after World War II, the church continued to be there. And so there's sort of a long enduring presence of the Orthodox Church there in Atka. It does kind of go to show that the missionaries were very faithful in keeping up that Russian fur trade. Orthodox Church. Now, according to the Orthodox website, the church is a central part of Atka village life. So you can imagine the building is used for church services, but also for community events. And also, according to the website, it says its mission is to be faithful in fulfilling the commandment of Christ to go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. So clearly, the long presence of the Orthodox Church there in Atka has played a key role in its cultural history. All right, so that is the story of Arctic Village and the story of Atka, as far as I could research it, at least. Doing my best to keep these as concise as I can, these village stories. No longer village profiles, we're calling them village stories. Tune in next week. We will hit the next 2 villages on the list. Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the stories of these next 2 villages. See you next time.